I'm JG Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Sorry for my absences of late. Been releasing a few less shows just because the last episode was so long and because I've been dealing with some family issues. As always, before we begin this edition of the program, I need to remind you that this show is almost entirely listener funded. I've been trying to get ad support. We'll see how that goes. But as of now, I only have one sponsor, and everything else is you, the listeners. So please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. You can also donate to me through PayPal if you email me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. Let me know if you want to do it that way, if you want to support the show that way. Also, if you can, check out my sponsor, Mike Swanson's WallStreetWindow.com, the best financial and trading newsletter out there. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips. So check it out. It's free of charge, WallStreetWindow.com. Sign up for the free newsletter. I believe he has an ebook on investing as well that you'll also get free of charge if you sign up to the newsletter. It's a really great resource. With that being said, on this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Tahir Amin, co-author of the new book, Pharma Monopoly, The Battle for the Future of Medicines. And boy, is this a great conversation. It's quick and brisk, 30 minutes, but it's full force, info-packed, and I highly recommend listening to it closely as we delve into why the price of medicines are so high and how it's not just an issue of the pharma bros like Martin Shkreli. This is much bigger than that. We delve into how it relates to third-way neoliberalism, the philanthro-capitalists like Bill Gates of the Gates Foundation, and patents. That plays a big role in the problems you're about to hear spoken about in the conversation to follow. All that and more on this edition of Parallax Views. Without any further ado, let's get right to it with Tahir Amin. Welcome to Parallax Views. I guess that I'm very happy to have on Tahir Amin, author, or co-author, I should say, of the book Pharma Monopoly, The Battle for the Future of Medicines, and also the CEO of the Initiative for Medicine Access and Knowledge, otherwise known as I-MAK. How are you doing?
Hi JG, nice to have you on. Have me on, thanks.
So let's dive right into this book, Pharma Monopoly. You begin by talking about the pandemic, and let's get into that. How does the pandemic from a few years back really inform your book?
Yeah, my co-author and I, we've been in the field for 20 years working on trying to make medicines more affordable and accessible around the world. We've worked in numerous countries around the world, and I've spent the last 10 years focusing efforts in the United States on trying to make medicines affordable, given the sort of rising drug prices here and the drug pricing crisis. But the pandemic really informed us, or really got us thinking in terms of how do we address these issues which keep reappearing. And the pandemic, being the biggest public health crisis in the last 100 years, showed a number of people went without vaccine shots because of these rules called intellectual property, which are patents that companies get on vaccines or medicines that prevent others from manufacturing. And the real question that we had that really spurred this book was, where are the solutions when we have these massive public health crises which still deny billions getting access to vaccines? I mean, I think in the introduction to the book we say by the time the pandemic was officially declared over by the World Health Organization in 2023, I think that was May, some 2.2 billion people around the world still had not received a shot, a single shot, whereas many of the people in the wealthy countries had stockpiles that could have treated people 6 times over. So that we really do have an inequitable medicine system, but both at home here in the United States, but very much globally.
One of the really interesting aspects of your book is how you discuss the WTO or the World Trade Organization and its intellectual property roles. Do you want to discuss how that framework that the WTO created has led to a lot of problems and inequities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's one of the big features of the book, and also as somebody who's been in this field, it was right during writing that particular chapter, chapter two, I learned so much that I had not known when I first entered this field. I come from a private practice background. I've worked for some of the largest commercial law firms and also multinational companies. And then when I moved into the public interest work to work on this access to medicines issue, a lot of the talk was about the World Trade Organization because I arrived at this conversation around early 2000, and the World Trade Organization had come into being in 1995. There was this agreement on trade related aspects of intellectual property, which had brought into force these new standards for patent rights, intellectual property rights. But the prehistory to all that is often not talked about, and it's not even talked about often in our field in terms of public advocacy. And that prehistory really goes back to post World War II, where there was initially this discussion of creating an international trade organization. This was supposed to be the third wheel of after the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And this international trade organization was supposed to actually bring more of an equitable standard in terms of the political economy that was emerging post World War II. That pretty much died. Actually, it died in the US in the sort of just about around 1948. And then basically there was this gap, and many countries in the global south, the low income developing countries that were coming out of empires, the European empires, were demanding much a more fair and equitable system. And so during the 60s and 70s, there was this push to sort of reshape the political economy, but the United States and the Western countries resisted that because they didn't see it in their interests. And what eventually happened was you ended up going from a situation where you're looking for a more just and equitable global economic system to then the Pfizer's and the big corporations pushing the US government to support their agenda to get intellectual property into the trade negotiations. And the biggest trade negotiation happened around 1984 to 1991, which is the Uruguay round. And then we ended up with the WTO. And that then set up this new globalization of intellectual property, gave much more power to the pharmaceutical industry. And it's the reason why we have a lot of the ills that we have today when we're talking about high drug prices. A lot of folk often see the World Trade Organization as something that benefited the US, and it did immensely, but at the same time, it also backfired. The blowback of that, in terms of the monopoly power that the pharmaceutical industry and other sectors have been able to attain, is really now showing in terms of the outcomes of that.
Do you just want to talk more generally about pharmaceutical patents and how those are often overlooked? I mean, a lot of people criticize or complain about the monopolies of the pharmaceutical companies or big pharma, but I think the patent aspect, and I've talked to a few authors that have covered this, is often under discussed.
It is under discussed, I think, largely because there's this culture, particularly in the West, there's this culture that patents are sort of sacrosanct. They're almost like the Ten Commandments. You do not discuss them. They are a good thing. They are the sign of progress. The more patents we have, the more quote unquote innovation we have, or invention, which is really what the patent system is supposed to be about. And the reason people don't discuss them is because there's a lot of political power that comes with the patent system. In a way, the World Trade Organization was was using this, was trying to actually export the patent system to other countries that never previously had them. And what patents do really is lock knowledge down. They privatize knowledge, all under the intention of, well, we want to drive investment, so we'll get these new technological discoveries and new medicines. But what's happened is that the patent system has sort of eroded over time, and its integrity, if it had any in the first place, has become a system where it's a financial tool for the big corporations. They get all these patents, they block off large swaths of knowledge so that nobody can actually do research or even compete in a space. And really, it's all to drive the sort of quarterly revenue cycles that they must meet in order to keep their investors happy. And so, really, the idea of a patent system now being about invention and something that's new and new knowledge, I don't see that anymore. I think if we're looking at it critically, it's become almost an investment for exclusivity system that if you've got money to invest in something, you'll get a patent, you can block off competition. You just doesn't necessarily mean you're actually seeking anything scientifically new.
Can you give some concrete examples, just for my listeners' sake, of how the sort of framework that has been pushed about pharmaceutical patents has actually been detrimental in many ways?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many cases when you look at and you dig into it, and this is something that my organization has done for the last 8, 9 years to really bring this issue to the fore. And thankfully, people in Congress are starting to listen, and the conversation around patents and drug pricing has started to be at the center of these discussions and policy solutions. But to give you an example, let's take a drug like Humira. Humira was a rheumatoid arthritis drug, is a biologic drug that really its development happened in the 80s by a couple of a British scientist who was what you might say was the original inventor architect of the underlying antibody. And then what happened was these scientists worked with the German company BASF, which had a division called Knoll Pharmaceuticals, and then Abbott Laboratories, as it was known then, now it's called AbbVie, actually acquired that technology. And what they did was they didn't invent anything per se, the underlying technology. What they then looked at it was how they tested and developed the drug through clinical trials. So there is an investment there. I'm not going to disagree with that. How much they spent, we don't know because we never see those figures. Those figures are not transparent. They keep telling us it's billions, but we don't know. So it's almost like you have to trust somebody who's actually got a reason to try and make as much money out of the system to say, oh yeah, it costs billions of dollars, so therefore we must justify their cost. I think that's a part of a conversation that needs to be had. And then what they did was they patented every aspect, every variation. So for example, in the initial patent, it said that this particular antibody could treat various indications. It could be sort of anything with any kind of inflammation. It could be rheumatoid arthritis. It could be psoriasis. It could be Crohn's disease. And these are all kind of the same. The mechanism of action of the underlying antibody is the same, but what they did, they could actually then test it to try and treat different conditions. And they patent each and every different condition over and over. So you get these overlapping rights, which extend out the patent protection. Usually you get 20 years from filing for the original patent. But what they then do is they layer on all these other various features, the formulation, a different needle, a different dosage. And this is what AbbVie did. And instead of their patent coming off in 2016 in the United States, so that meant competition could have come in, they had about, I think by our count, they had some 300 and over 300 patent applications, of which nearly 200 had been granted. And they then used those in litigation, and they were able to extract another 7 years of exclusivity. And in just those 7 years, they made 114 billion in revenue and were able to increase the price twofold in that period of 7 years. So it just goes to show why patents have become this instrument for the industry to basically block competition, keep
And create monopolies.
and create monopolies, keep the prices high. And also, what I feel is actually less spoken about with this is they're sitting on knowledge which they're not even going to use. They squat on all these they have all these different patents around basically different ways to make the drug because they want to block off all the different routes that other companies might make. So they're squatting on knowledge, which is actually should be in the public domain.
Now, I want to talk about chapter 3 of the book, which I found very fascinating because it deals with neoliberalism and specifically third way neoliberalism, which is the sort of center left neoliberalism that comes after the era of Reagan. It's embodied by the likes of Bill Clinton and later Tony Blair, even Barack Obama. And it's sort of seen, as you put it, as the human face. That sort of softens the image of neoliberalism while preserving market dominance. What's your critique of the third way, and how does it tie into all of this?
Yeah, so that was another feature of the book that really we thought about as having spent 20 years in this field. The thing about the third way neoliberalism is it gives the illusion that we are trying to resolve these inequitable systems that have emerged or the inequities that have emerged out of the systems. And basically what it ultimately does is we're not going to actually have more regulation of the those who have the power, the corporations, the pharmaceutical industry, for example, in this case. What we're going to do is we're going to basically curry favor from them and seek their charity. And hopefully they will actually have they will bite the PR sort of aspect of this and sort of donate some medicines. Like going back to COVID, for example, the way we didn't structurally change the system that we had, even in that particular crisis. What we did was we were seeking charitable donations of vaccines, many of which often were actually expired by the time they arrived in their country. So that's what third way neoliberalism is. It's actually we won't actually we'll keep the status quo, but we'll just show the aspects of like we're going to get some little bit of changes here and there that are minorly incremental. We're not going to upset the apple cart. We're not going to take away power from these corporations that we've actually neoliberalism gave to these corporations that actually put us in this mess. Because really, it's not about structural systemic reform, transformation. It's really about keeping things the way they are and the power systems the way they are.
I wanted to ask in relation to this. In that chapter, you talk quite a bit about the medicines patent poll. What is that? I mean, it's seen as a success by many, but I think you and your co-author take a slightly different view. I think you would say, well, yeah, it expands access in the short term, but it doesn't fix everything. And it may
Yeah,
even actually legitimize that monopoly power.
yeah, and I think that there's a lot of contentious views on this, and I, for example, was at the forefront with a lot of other organizations at the time back in 2010 when the medicines patent pool really became a thing. It was actually it created a split in civil society in in the access to medicines movement because there were people in the global south who really wanted to resist and challenge these new monopoly systems that the World Trade Organization had created through the trade-related aspects of intellectual property that was part of the WTO. And then there were folk who, well-meaning, were saying, well, these rules are coming in, we're going to have to improve access somehow. So let's try and see if we can actually get these kind of more public health oriented licenses where we encourage the companies, and this is the third way neoliberalism, we encourage these companies to try and offer licenses to these markets that they don't particularly care about because they're not going to make profit out of them. So, many of the countries in Africa where they could just sort of give these licenses to other Indian generic manufacturers or any other generic manufacturer to make these drugs, like these HIV drugs. And there was also, legitimately there was a ticking time bomb because the potential numbers of people living with HIV were going to be expanding, and we needed to treat those people. So that was the argument from the other side. But what was really sold as an idea at the time, and I remember being part of these discussions with people who were advocating for the medicines patent, they said that basically we won't do this at all costs. If we can't get all middle income countries and low income countries in these licenses, then we won't pursue those licenses. We will say, okay, we'll use other measures. But that's not what happened. What they did was it eventually became like, as with all ideas or even ideas of legislation, things get watered down, political pressures, other influences. And I feel that's where the disagreement really happened. And, you know, people like to present it as though it was this kind of whole cohesive civil society effort. Actually, this what we tried to tell in that story is no, it was not. And I think the repercussions, as you say, it's actually only emboldened the monopoly power. of pharmaceutical industries, because what they do now is eventually they're going to say, well, we don't even have to give these licenses. And we've seen some examples of that. They've shrunk the number of countries that they give these licenses to. The Indian generic manufacturers who were largely resisting the big pharmaceutical companies have all kind of got into line and are very compliant and acquiesce now. So any kind of resistance to the power of the industry has largely been sort of dissolved and removed by the medicines patent pool, and then that's the kind of main thesis of that chapter. And so you can't tell the difference between this public health organization, the medicines patent pool, where that actually ends and where does the pharmaceutical industry influence begin. They're so intertwined. I mean, in fact, they're talking largely from the same hymn sheet.
One of the most fascinating aspects of your book was the way in which you and your co-author tackle the philanthro-capitalists, as you referred to them in the book, because I think that's a difficult topic for some people because, we hear all kinds of like the most wild conspiracy theories about, say, the Gates Foundation from, people into, QAnon or whatever conspiracy. You're actually providing a grounded reality-based critique though, and I think sometimes people overlook the reality-based critique of the Gates Foundation and the sort of philanthro-capitalist optimism, this optimism that philanthropy can fix everything alone.
Yeah, and I think this really feeds back into the neoliberalism that has shaped our political economies, our lives for the last 50, 60 years. Is in a way, I think philanthrocapitalism is a result of the neoliberal policies that have shrunk government interventions, made the government smaller. And so what we've done is almost farmed out those solutions to these private actors who gained a lot of their wealth through these neoliberal policies. I mean, Gates was a major beneficiary of the World Trade Organization rules of intellectual property for his software company. That's how he made his billions. And here we are, people see that, oh, wow, he's pledging so much money, so much of his wealth to try and tackle these diseases around the world and vaccines. Yeah, that's great. But what comes with that is another power element. In a way, you've got the pharmaceutical industry on the top sort of rung of the ladder, and then you've got Gates, who's also using his power to shape public health. I mean, he is currently, I believe, the largest donor to the World Health Organization now that the United States has withdrawn. And he has immense power to shape how public health systems work. And his goal, based on our experiences, is not to challenge the pharmaceutical industry. His goal is to actually just sort of prop up the existing system. And
Well, I
so
was going to say real quick, I think he was strongly against waiving patents during the pandemic.
absolutely, yeah. I mean, at the time we were all there seeing his words on TV interviews saying he thought that the waiving of intellectual property rights or particularly patents was a silly idea. It was nonsense. And in fact, his own foundation had to backtrack from that given the public criticism. But so really Gates is interested in this, and we focus on Gates because he is the most powerful actor in the public health sphere when it comes to medicines and what have you. Now, when we look at philanthropy at large, which there are folk philanthropists who are trying to change some of these systems. I mean, I'm a beneficiary of philanthropy run that for my organization. I do receive dollars from foundations. And the goal is to try and actually educate foundations to say, if we really want structural change and the deeper change, then these are the things that we need to do. And often it's a deeper conversation. So not all philanthropy is in the same vein as what we talk about in that chapter. There are great efforts that are happening. But I feel ultimately we cannot solely rely on philanthropy. I think that's the ultimate message. Philanthropy cannot be the sort of end game here. Governments have to act in the interest of their public. And unfortunately, a lot of our governments, through the neoliberal constructs that we've created, are acting in the private interest first before they act on behalf of their sort of elected members.
How important was it for you to cover not just the issue of patents, but also the financialization of this pharmaceutical industry, how it's more focused often on financialization rather than science, and specifically, how important was it for you to point out that, this is not just an issue of the pharma bros. This is not just a Martin Shkreli thing. They may not even be the exception. There is a real embedded problem that goes deeper than a few bad apples.
Yeah, you just have to track the history of the pharmaceutical industry. These were smaller companies in the past, family owned even, and then basically they became public and the shareholders started to have more of a say in how the business is run. And now today, particularly this has come with a whole host of other sort of factors, particularly again, neoliberalism opened the door to a lot of this, what we call the financialization of the a lot of what non-financial industries, particularly the pharmaceutical sector, but others as well. And by that we mean financialization is where these businesses are run as almost the same way that the financial industry runs itself. It's all about shareholder maximization. It's all about profits, all about maximizing revenue. And I think really one can trace it back, and at least we do, to a particular op-ed or opinion piece written by the economist Milton Friedman back in the 70s, where he said that the duty of a CEO is to actually maximize profit and serve the shareholders, not to actually have any kind of social responsibility. And I think that's really caught on in a lot of the sort of MBAs and the way it's taught in business schools. And I think that's the culture that has actually sort of become pervasive among CEOs of the world, is that basically I have to seek out as much profit as possible. Doesn't matter what any the social ills that I'm creating and the difficulties I'm creating for society. My goal is to get profit at any cost, and I think that's what the pharmaceutical industry is about today. It's not about actually really inventing new products, and well, they invent new product, but they don't invent new knowledge and new science. They either buy that in, or they're just looking to do these little tweaks to existing knowledge, the way AbbVie did with Humira, in order to expand the life cycle of an existing drug.
How important is it for people to realize that it is bigger than just a few bad pharma bros?
Oh yeah, no, the whole Shkreli thing. I mean, I always say I think there's an old proverb somewhere I read somewhere that the big thieves hang the small thieves, and essentially it was the industry put out Shkreli to try, because he was actually basically telling them how the system was working. And even Ramaswamy, the incumbent who was trying to run for president a few years ago and is now running in Ohio, even he was saying that the big pharma industry does this all the time. The idea that it's only these kind of few rotten apples that are doing it. No, financialization is rife in the industry, and various investigations by congressional hearings have shown how much more these companies spend on what we call share buybacks and dividends than actually investing in R&D. I mean, a great example of that is happening with these GLP-1 drugs, for example. If you look at a company like Novo Nordisk, we have we did a report in my organization did a report where we actually looked at how much is likely to go back to share buybacks and then actually into R&D. And Novo Nordisk, by some calculation, is spending almost 72 cents of the dollar that they get on share buybacks, and they are in R&D. So this idea that the industry likes to promote that, oh, we need all this revenue to do, then reinvest back into R&D. It's not. It's going into people's pockets and investors' pockets to enrich them, and it's not doing anything for the actual the employees of the company necessarily. I think Novo Nordisk kind of laid off 9,000 employees last year. So really, where is that money going?
I know we're running low on time, but two things quickly here. AI. You have a whole chapter near the end of the book on AI. You guys aren't necessarily anti AI, like, oh, it can't have any uses, but there is a concern that this AI is developing within existing power structures, and that could actually intensify monopoly power.
Yeah, no, I have thought a little bit more about this personally since we wrote the book, and aside from what we say in the book about how AI is probably going to drive more personalized medicine, which is going to be just really trying to target the more wealthy people, even more so than we already have. I think my biggest concern is I see what's happening with the ownership of knowledge, or the kind of concentration of knowledge through these AI systems, i.e., they're just scraping out all this knowledge that's on the in the public domain and they're kind of locking it up in algorithms. I see this as kind of the next frontier of what the intellectual property system did sort of 50, 60 years ago in terms of creating monopolies. And in fact, whereas we have sort of maybe slightly more, more disparate monopolies amongst the intellectual property system, we're going to actually have more concentrated monopolies where fewer actors are going to hold this information, and we're going to actually be in a much worse position than we already are. So I don't see this as a new way of sort of economic thinking. It's just the kind of the next evolution of the intellectual property system, and it's going to come through the AI mechanisms of just locking information in an algorithm that then will be sold back to us as a utility. And it's really our knowledge, which is what the intellectual property system did. I mean, I was just watching a post by Senator Warren saying that, oh, these are this is public funded knowledge that these AI companies are now using to enrich themselves. And I feel that was the same argument 50 years ago with intellectual property when they were trying to expand it. So why aren't we looking back at that retrospective and saying, actually, we need to correct that?
Closing out here, what can we do? What can be done?
I think there is movement for people are fed up with the high costs of medicines. I mean, we did a survey, a global national survey, it's bipartisan, and people see the patent system as being a major problem in terms of how competition enters, how generics come onto the market sooner, and they want relief. I think we have to start getting more public participation in these institutions that actually grant these powers, such as the US Patent Trademark Office. These conversations happen really. I mean, those institutions are captured, and by captured I mean the corporations really drive the conversations. And I think we need to get more public voices in there, patients' voices. I think also we need to start building other systems such as public production, public manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, and instead of the NIH basically licensing out their basic science, the underlying inventions to the private sector, they should actually start creating systems that actually build these medicines from a government perspective that can at least serve the low income and middle income populations in the United States and around the world.
I want to thank you again, Tahir, for coming on Parallax Views. There's so much more we could have gotten into. I wish I could have asked you about the innovation trap, but we were short on time. How can my listeners keep up with your work, and what do you hope they get out of this conversation?
Thanks for having me on, JG. I mean, for me, it's really trying to reach new audiences. It's really trying to get folk aware of issues, which, like you said, people don't talk about patterns. Really getting them to help them understand what is really at the root of this. And I think really this is the goal of my organization and the work I've been doing for the last 20 years is really trying to get to root issues and not trying to drive incremental changes and reform, because we've tried all these incremental aspects and really we're no better off. In fact, the inequities are widening, and people can follow my work on X. I'm on X at Real Tahir Amin. I'm on LinkedIn. You can go to im-mak.org where you can sign up to our newsletters and really write to your representatives, write to people who are at your state level, write to the US Patent and Trademark Office and saying, I want to know more about how patents are playing a role in driving high drug prices. Get them to answer your queries.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.